Hey everybody, my name is Maureen. I also go by Mo, and I'm the Director of Regional Partnerships with Local Environmental Agriculture Project, also known as LEAP. And before we get started today, I'm just going to give everybody a brief overview of the Roanoke Regional Food System Partnership, which is the network that's coordinating this learning exchange series today. So just so we're all oriented around the network and the network, the food systems network we've been developing in the Roanoke region. So real quick, little history. This partnership started through a USDA grant in October 2020. So we're about a little over a year into the project. And LEAP is serving as a fiscal agent and the kind of core facilitator, although there's numerous food systems leaders that we're partnering with on this project. And the goal was basically to bring stakeholders across diverse sectors of the food system together to really work toward creating a more resilient and socially just food system in the Roanoke region. So the way that we're defining the region of the Roanoke region, since there's so many ways to parcel out geographic regions, is all the contiguous counties surrounding Roanoke City and Salem City. So here you can see we have Craig, Botetourt, Bedford, Franklin, Floyd, and Montgomery. And while we are continuing to grow as a network, here you can see at the top, these are the kind of core leadership partners of the Regional Food System Partnership. And then we have an array of amazing partners across the defined region, and that continues to grow and evolve and change as our partnership develops. So as we were coming together as a network and really forming and defining what we wanted to create together, we created a guiding star and a near star. So the guiding star is really kind of our long-term vision of what we're trying to create as a partnership. And our guiding star is to create an equitable and resilient food and farm system that produces health and abundance in the Roanoke region. And then the near star, which is kind of our short-term goal in order to work toward our guiding star, is to mobilize an expansive network to create a collaborative, action-oriented framework to prioritize food and farming systems in the region. And so that's where the Regional Food System Partnership comes in. So over the past year, just real quick, what we've been really working toward is going through a systems mapping process to really understand what barriers and opportunities exist within the Roanoke region within the food system. So visually mapping to understand enabling factors and inhibiting factors that operate. And so over here, you can see an image of a systems map to get a sense of the complexity of the food systems and the ways that all the different factors are at play constantly. And it really takes systems thinking to understand how to affect and impact change across the larger food system. And then on top of that, just assessing the literature. So there's been already so much amazing work done within the Roanoke Regional Food System, numerous assessments of our region's food system and different recommendations that have already been made, and then obviously across the broader literature as well. So we did this kind of big research process in order to determine what our priorities as a network are. And through this long process, we landed on creating 4 main goals. So the first goal is to support and connect healthy food access efforts across the Roanoke region. The second goal, nourish a regional food and farming system through story sharing, forging connections between our regional identity, history, and our future economic development, and rooting opportunity in the caretaking of our physical and living environments. The third is create regional food production, processing, and distribution systems that promote the health and wealth of the community, farmers, and the land. And then the fourth is to co-create a dynamic structure and support system that fosters trusting and transparent relationships for the common goal of good food for all. So as we created these 4 goals, we have since reorganized ourselves into working groups oriented around the 4 goals so that our stakeholders can kind of self-select which aspects of the food system they'd like to work on. And each goal has 2 co-leads that are overseeing the facilitation of that goal. And all the co-leads kind of make up the leadership team of the Regional Food System Partnership. So within each goal, there's a working group that meets every month. And the working groups are really working to define kind of action plans for kind of specific initiatives that they'd like to undertake as a working group. So, you know, as you're on this call and learning more about regional food system partnerships and the way that they've been done in other areas, I invite you all, if you're interested, to feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in getting involved in the Roanoke Regional Food System Partnership. So from here, I'll pass it off to Eric and to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you for that introduction. I'm Eric Benfelt with Virginia Tech and Virginia Cooperative Extension, and specifically with the Center for Food Systems Transformation, Food Systems and Community Transformation. And we're very pleased to have Karen Bessarab from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and Dr. Becca Jablonski of Colorado University with us to talk about food policy structures and governance, a regional food system planning perspective. And as part of this regional partnership, we're having 4 learning series from January through April, and really wanted to focus specifically on the idea of structures and governance and learning from both a national and regional perspective, and then also hearing more specifically about the experience in Colorado. And I'd like to introduce both of the speakers, and afterwards they'll both give presentations, and then we'll have facilitated discussion time and question and answers. Karen, she serves as the Senior Program Officer with Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, specifically in the area of food, communities, and public health. And she has a primary focus on managing the Food Policy Network project, which is a national resource hub for local and regional councils across the US as well as Canada. And Karen holds 2 master's degrees from the University of Texas at Austin in community and regional planning and public policy. And I know I've been able to interact with Karen on a number of different occasions related to regional food policy, as well as closing the hunger gap. And Dr. Becca Jablonski, she's an associate professor in food systems extension economist at Colorado State University. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts and a PhD from Cornell University, and has 2 primary research and extension programs, just evaluating the farm, ranch, and business profitability impacts through non-commodity markets, specifically local, regional, and community food systems. And then also has done a lot of work on assessing the community economic impacts of food system policies, investments, and programs, with an emphasis on identifying strategies to support entrepreneurship, improve business performance, and enhance regional food systems. And again, very pleased to have Karen and Becca share their experience and expertise with us. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you all for inviting us to be here and present. I'm excited to talk with you today, and also excited to be here co-presenting with Becca as well. I'm going to share a little bit about what we know about food policy councils, some of their structure and governance and their activities across the US. And so if you'll give me a minute, I'm going to share some slides before I begin. So like Eric said, I work primarily on a project called the Food Policy Networks Project. It's a project that's been with the Center for a Livable Future for since 2013, and we track and kind of monitor and research what's happening with food policy councils across the US. And previously we were looking at Canada as well. Our role is to provide technical assistance, to be a resource. We have a website that has a resource database of over 1,300 resources related to food systems, policy, and food policy councils. We moderate a listserv that's intended to be a resource for individuals that are interested in food systems policy to be able to share information and ask questions. And then we also do presentations like this, offer curbside consulting, one-on-one conversations with councils and members. And we, every 12 to 18 months, we survey or try to survey all the food policy councils across the US, with some success and some not. But so we have a kind of a repository of information and a collection of understanding of councils and their evolution and changes over time, and then various scales across the US. So mostly what I'll focus on today is what we know about regional, and I was excited to be invited to give this presentation because we haven't really dug into the information around regional councils separate from those that work at a city or county level. And there seems to be a rising interest in looking at food systems from the regional scale, and particularly kind of how do you build a council at a regional scale. So to start, I'm going to back up before I get into it to kind of define what we consider to be a food policy council. There's a lot of impressions of what they are, that they're like a board of a nonprofit organization, that they have a steering committee and a set number of members. And what we're finding is that the structure and arrangements of food policy councils are very diverse. They have a lot of it depends on the context and where they're located. Who's available, who's around, who's working in that region, what the issues are that they're focusing on, if they're an urban area versus a rural area, if they're working at a state level versus a city level. So we use kind of 3 pillars to define what a council is. One is that they're an organized group of stakeholders that bring together individuals from various sectors across the food system and to other domains that connect with the food system. So one element is that they have to bring together multiple stakeholders. The second is that their aim is, or their goal, mission, vision is to work across the food system. So they're taking this broad view, this kind of more holistic view of the food system and working on different elements of that versus being specifically focused on one element of our food system, say anti-hunger work or supporting new and beginning farmers. And then lastly, that there's an intent to work on policy. We know that as councils grow and mature, they tend to pick up and work more on policy. A lot of the beginning work is foundational in terms of building relationships and trust amongst members. And so they might not be able to work on policy right at the get-go. So if there's an intent that they want to, then we consider them to be a food policy council. And they can be of any name. They can be a task force, a work group, a food and farm coalition, so long as they're kind of in the realm of those 3 elements. So since the last count that we have of the number of food policy councils across the US was at the end of last year, and there are 288 councils across the US. We've seen the numbers go up and peak. I think the last peak was around 2017, and it's gone down somewhat, and we're not quite sure what that is, but also know that our data kind of lags. We find out about new councils later on and add them, and so this all constantly gets adjusted, but it's in the range of having 288 councils across the US. In terms of regional, about 19% of those responded to our survey saying that they're regional. However, as we look into what does it mean for them to be regional, that number kind of fluctuates. Because some of them may consider themselves regional if they work in a city and a county, but we're looking more broadly at them working across multiple counties, a larger geographic region, and also that their focus isn't just necessarily feeding into one specific urban area, and the urban area being that sole focus, that they're trying to address what's happening across the region. So when we kind of dig into our information on regional councils more, what we find is that there are around 43 regional councils across the US in 2021, and they were in 25 states. Most of these are multi-county or a geographic region within a state. There are about 3 that span state boundaries. 72% of them are over 6 years old. So there's a greater number of them that are mature, more mature than say some of the urban councils. And that when we kind of dig into what they define as their region, it's not necessarily drawn around set geographic boundaries such as a county. A couple of them use more of a broader kind of, this is our conservation area, or it's open to those that are in this region and are participating in our group. So this is a map showing where we see most of the regional councils across the US. The darker the number, the more they have. Michigan has the most, they have about 7 regional councils. Oregon has 5. And then the other numbers are 3, 2, and 1. Sorry, I keep losing my cursor. So what makes up a region? For the councils, a number of them define their region based on county boundaries. There's one that was defining it based on their conservation districts and having multiple conservation districts and what they would define as the region. There's a couple that have defined it as a mile radius outside of an urban center. The map is from a group that's in Massachusetts, and they've drawn a line around what is their region, and it encompasses about 35 different counties are part of them. One council in Maine defines their region as the towns that surround a bay area. And then in Michigan, there is a council that has defined it as the willingness of those committed to the food system in their area to be a part of this network and to facilitate engagement in supporting the local food system. So in terms of the organizational structure of regional councils, most of them are either about 42% are housed in a nonprofit, and that includes regional planning commissions. It also includes land trusts. It seems that there's a lot more regional councils that are supported by a resource conservation and development organization or a development corporation. There's a lot more ties to kind of economic development entities within the region. And also there's much more engagement in terms of regional councils and land conservation or land trusts. Another thing to note is that when we look across all councils in the US, 25% of them tend to be embedded in government. With regional councils, only about 10 of them are embedded in government. And I think that's about 4 councils. So it's not a huge amount, and that kind of fits with this model that they're looking across a greater geographic span and a lot more levels of government. In addition, we have a question in our survey that asks about the relationship to government because these entities are working on policy. And about 65% of regional councils have government employees at some level that are members of their council. What we find that's different at this level, though, is that less are created by legislation and less have government members or government representatives that appoint the members to their councils. And then lastly, looking across all the membership, who representation on a food policy council, we ask about categories of different sectors that may be represented on a food policy council. And most of this tracks along with the rest of the food policy councils. There's a couple of kind of interesting points in that for regional food policy councils, you see more representation from economic development, more representation from individuals that represent processing and distribution, a little bit more from food production, but you see less representation from public health, faith-based organizations, and those engaged in food waste and recovery. I can't say that these are significant differences, but in terms of the percentage of members, there is a slight difference. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about 4 councils and their different structures and what they've worked on, kind of the activities that they've done. The first example is from the Greater Quabbin Food Alliance, which is in Massachusetts, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name. This council was formed in 2013. It's housed in a nonprofit organization, which is the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. And it is an informal network of individuals that come together. So their structure is open. Anyone can join a meeting. They publish it on their website. They have working groups that are open to anyone that wants to join a working group. They have around 3 to 4 working groups that are focused on farm to institution, food access and health, food waste reduction and compost, and then supporting local agriculture. And the way that this came together is this council formed because there were a number of entities and alliances that were working in some element related to the food system. And so they decided that they needed to start bringing these groups together across the region to create more efficiencies and reduce redundancy in the work they were doing, and to have more coordination and communication across these entities. And so the alliance sprung out based on those conversations. Thus far, their focus has been somewhat on helping to steward conservation areas and land protection projects. They've been doing some outreach, supporting farm to school food service directors in order to help them to purchase from local farms, regional farms in the area, do local procurement and provide training. They've also worked to create a community market in one of the downtown Orange. And then they've really kind of helped to increase information sharing between 3 of their regional planning commissions. So a lot of their work is around uplifting the value of their local food system and trying to integrate it more into this, into their regional planning commissions, which typically for regional planning commissions don't focus on food systems. A lot of their work falls around energy and transportation. And so food systems is a newer area for them to be engaged more in. The next council example is from the Western Upper Peninsula Food Systems Collaborative in Michigan. This group also formed in 2013, and it's another example of a loose, open network that's open to anyone that wants to participate. They consider themselves to be a grassroots coalition, so they're not housed within one entity. They're not fiscally sponsored by one agency. They also, and so anyone is welcome to join them. And this is the one where I mentioned earlier that defines their region based on kind of who is there in the region that's showing up to support food systems. They do have a little bit more of a structure than the Alliance, and in that they have a planning team that helps to kind of guide and shepherd the work of their collaborative forward. And then they have work groups as well. They have been one of the latest initiatives that they've taken on, which is a farm to school initiative that they launched in 2021 with funding from the Michigan Health Endowment, Michigan Health Endowment Fund. The state of Michigan has had a Michigan Good Food Charter, I believe since 2012, but I'm not exact on that date. They're going through a revision right now. And one of the elements of this Good Food Charter is to increase the purchase of locally grown foods in the state of Michigan by 20%. And so one of the ways to do that is through local food procurement through schools and institutions. And so this charter was set by a group of individuals, and then Michigan has a support network for councils across the state, and it's up to them to opt into supporting this charter. And a number of them have done that or have set up structures in order to be able to help facilitate more procurement of local foods. And so the Western Upper Peninsula Food Systems Collaborative is doing the same thing in terms of their work with Farm to School, in terms of helping to increase the amount of food that's procured by local institutions. During the pandemic, we saw their work kind of grow and expand a lot because they already had this foundation set up of a network of farmers and growers that already had relationships and were in communication. So once the pandemic hit, they started bi-weekly virtual meetings. They started a listserv for growers that continues today for them to have some way to communicate with one another and coordinate their services. They created a community garden and farmers market safety guide. They also have an interesting resource that's for local governments to help them integrate food systems policy and planning documents into their work, and it's called a Food Systems Planning Policy Catalog, which has model languages that local governments can pull from if they're interested in creating ordinances or policies or integrating it to any plans that they're working on. So it's readily accessible and available on their website. The next example is a newer example of a council that's in North Carolina, and I promise I will move off of the East Coast with the last example. This is the Piedmont Triad Regional Food Council, and I included it because this one is embedded or housed within a regional planning council, and it is their fiscal and administrative support. Their beginning starts in 2017 when they started having meetings and talking about the formation of the council. It took them 2 years to get to the point where they formally formed their council, where they had members, where they had written bylaws that were signed off on. And so I bring this up as an example of a council that while they have been in the formation for a number of years prior to 2019, it took them to that point to get the structure, foundation, the members together to move forward. And so they officially launched in 2019. They cover a 12 county region. They do have more of a formal structure where they have 25 members that are appointed for 2-year terms. One of the first activities they did was to create a local food infrastructure inventory map to set their bylaws, and now they're moving forward with funding to do a regional food system assessment. But it took them those 2 years, and they feel like they're in a good place to move forward with an assessment because of the relationships that they built. And then, oops, sorry about that. And then the last council is in Indiana. It's the Northwest Indiana Food Council. This council was formed in 2015. It is a standalone nonprofit organization. It was started with support from the Northwestern Indiana Regional Planning Commission. And they're rock stars at raising money. I don't know what they're doing, but they've generated a bunch of funding through USDA local food procurement, their farmers market promotion program and the local food promotion program. They've gotten some grants from some regional foundations as well. They cover a 7-county region, and they only have 14 members, and they're all volunteer based. So while they do have funding, it is not covering their staff. It's covering other projects to be launched. So they have what's called Region Roots, which is a virtual food hub that they're starting to launch. I believe it was last year. They've done some interesting things in terms of during the pandemic. They co-hosted a Latinx farm worker listening session to understand kind of how the quality of life of farm workers was being affected. And this resulted in the delivery of farm to food box distribution to these farm workers. And now they're looking at programming to support them. They also launched what's called the Lake County Local Eats, which was a development of a farmers market in food insecure communities through funding from the USDA. And then they were awarded a local food procurement program grant to hire a value chain coordinator that would support farmers to help them to scale up for wholesale markets. So they're a tiny but mighty group that's doing a lot within the 7-county region in Northwest Indiana. And that's kind of a snippet into the world of regional food councils across the US. There's my email address. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation, and I will turn it over to Becca.
All right. Hi, everybody. Always great to go after Karen. Thank you for that. So today I'm actually going to be putting on a different hat than I've been wearing as much these days. As part of my position at Colorado State University, I have been on and off facilitating the Governor's Food Systems Advisory Council. We actually recently, and I'll talk about this more in a second, were able to get funds over the past few years to actually move the council technically under the umbrella of Colorado State University now. And we, with that shift, were able to get funding to actually hire essentially one FTE to manage the council. And so that has been very helpful, because I will say that I did my best to keep it afloat, but also have a full-time job. So it's been much better to have somebody who could be full-time devoted to it. And what we actually decided to do, initially we used those funds to hire a single person, but now when that person resigned, we've actually used the funds to hire somebody 25% time who's administering the council, and that's Lillian Brislin, who just came to Colorado State from the University of Kentucky. And then we have a 50% administrative assistant. And then we use the other 25% to basically hire consultants to do work on particular topics. And so that actually seems to be working out pretty well for us. So the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council was initially established through Senate Bill 10106, which was in 2010. You can see that 10 is the year of the bill. And it's been having quarterly meetings since then. So the people on the council are actually appointed by the governor. And I will tell you that our current governor really plays a very active role in selecting these individuals. So it's not something that he just doles off to somebody else. He's really engaged in the process. And then what happens is that there is a sunset date that's been put into each of these bills. And so every few years, we have to actually get it renewed and reapproved. And so that's happened several times. And as I mentioned, in 2019 was when COVSAC was actually formally moved over to CSU. So it is formally at CSU, but that being said, as you know, some of you work for universities, and especially land-grant university, we are not they're sort of advocating for policies and regulation. And so it's a little bit of a fine line, right? Our job is to facilitate the council, not to advocate for those policies. What we actually get is about $107,000 a year. There's a little more than that that goes to sort of CSU overhead, but the $107,000 is what the council actually has to spend on that FTE. So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about what the 2020 focus was, because that was when the council was completely reseated and moved to CSU, and the first time that we had actual funds to have this full-time person support the council. And so that individual, Blake Angelo, really spent a lot of time developing bylaws and operating procedures and strategic direction. And they formed these 4 committees that you can see here under point number 2. However, as I'm sure you're well aware, 2020 was, a lot happening in the world with COVID. And so what ends up happening was that the council shifted pretty fast to have these COVID responsive working groups focused on some key topic areas. And I think importantly, what ended up happening was that it wasn't just members of the council that actually provided support within each of these areas, but that there were other people that were interested and who had knowledge and expertise who came in and provided support, so that there were actually sort of more worker bees than just those that are formally appointed to the council. And I just thought I'd show you really fast that like one of the things that came out of this was doing some work looking specifically at the small and mid-scale meat value chain, which has been a very hot topic, and thinking about some opportunities to provide additional investment and support for the small and mid-scale meat value chain. And there actually has been some specific programming and policies at the state level that I think have resulted from some of these recommendations. I also encourage you, if you want to go and take a look. There have been a number of outputs this year, in fact, with different types of policy briefs. And this is one of the places that we've been able to leverage some of those consulting dollars to provide support. These are, I think, really, really well done. I had no role in them, so I can say that they really, I think, did a great job with these topics that are very timely and relevant, specifically to Colorado, but actually things like universal school meals have broader applicability. But to shift now to sort of the focus of what we're talking about today, one of the things in the 2019 legislation that passed that COVSAC is mandated to do is to collaborate with serving as a resource to and receiving input from the local and regional policy councils in the state. So, many of our councils are very limited resource. We have a couple that do have funding for staff people, but most of them do not. And so many of them have similar needs in terms of the types of support and expertise that they want. Also, we found that there are times when a region's dealing with an issue and may not realize that another region's dealing with the same or a similar type issue, and that through maybe having these conversations across the state, we can elevate some of these regional issues to become of statewide importance or get more notice from the state. I just wanted to put in a plug here because this is something that's been contentious in our state. That when we read that legislation, we've used Johns Hopkins definition of a food policy council. So it's very broad. We don't just consider these to be the sort of formal councils that are mayoral appointed, for example, but also some of these coalitions. And just to say that there are some of the councils or coalitions in our state that have spent a lot of time thinking through this and have decided that they wanted to be coalitions and not councils. And we could talk about some of those differences, but just wanted to let you know, we do think about this broadly and thinking about who's included in this umbrella. So these are the councils or coalitions that we are working with in the state. One of them was just disbanded, and it's interesting, actually. They have been a formal policy council and are actually now in the process of sort of regrouping and forming in a non-formal way. So it's going to be interesting, and that's also an interesting case study to see why they wanted to do that. So one of the things that we have seen that's happened is Denver, Colorado is an interesting place because we have all of our population, not all of it, but the vast majority of our population is concentrated along the Front Range of Colorado, which is actually in the center of the state. People think of Denver as sort of on the eastern part because they think of our mountains out west. It's actually in the center part of the state. And so if you look at them, we have this sort of corridor where we have over 80% of our population. And Denver is really our big city. And Denver has been pretty proactive in thinking about its food policies. Denver has a Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council that's mayoral appointed. They went through a food visioning process, which is actually interesting because the person who at the time was the first person who was hired by the city and county of Denver to be the food systems administrator was the person who then became the first hired a facilitator for the state council. And so it's been interesting to have some of that connection. But anyway, Blake led this food visioning process with the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council that was signed by the mayor. And one of the things that it includes is that at least 25% of all of Denver's municipal procurement, food procurement, will be from Colorado grown and raised sources. Now, it actually is not that difficult to get to the 25%. But as I mentioned, right, our population is really concentrated along this Front Range region. And according to the Census of Agriculture in 2017, Denver had 12 farms, none that had more than $100,000 in gross cash farm income. Also, I work a lot in Denver. I can't name 12 farms. I think there's actually less than that, depending on how you define a farm. But if we use the USDA's definition. And I think these farms are really important for some educational and cultural perspectives, but they're not providing a lot of food, and they're certainly not able to provide that 25%. And so I wanted to highlight this because, given what Karen was talking about the region, what we know is that what Denver sets as its food policy impacts more than just Denver, right? It has these spillover effects. Yet, if we don't have these opportunities to bring these different food policy councils and coalitions together and think regionally, then sometimes the people who are involved in these conversations in Denver, for example, are focused on the impacts within Denver and not thinking about some of those sort of broader regional spillover effects, which are really important. So what Denver has been interested in adopting is the Good Food Purchasing Program that I'm guessing many are familiar with on this call. It's been adopted by many cities and school districts and others across the country. It has these 5 different value areas. So we've been having some conversations because there are pieces of what's included in here that are pretty controversial in a state like Colorado, where we are a cattle state. So for example, under animal welfare, you get additional points essentially if you do like meatless Mondays. So the assumption is that not procuring meat is positive animal welfare, and that has been pretty controversial and a point for discussion in our state. And one of the things that we've seen in having these sort of regional conversations is that there's a real high level of distrust across food system actors. I'm sure this is true. I'm guessing it's true in Virginia as well, but it's certainly true in Colorado. We just had a very controversial legislative session. And just as one example, Colorado passed an ag workers' rights bill This was really pushed by largely urban stakeholders in the Front Range, without much conversation with farmers and ranchers before it got into the debate period. And so, we're really trying to think about how can we get our state and our food system, ag and food system stakeholders to a place where we can have these conversations maybe before bills are pushed, so that we have a better understanding of how different bills would affect different types of stakeholders. And so this may be, a little bit optimistic, right? But this is where we're trying to get to a place where we can have a shared vision and a better understanding of different types of opportunities and challenges and how they might impact these different stakeholders. So what we did was in 2020, we held the state's first Colorado Food Summit that was sponsored by Colorado State University, but also by many of our local food policy councils, and really trying to think about how we can build better linkages and have better conversations across the state. And now we're planning to have the next food summit in ideally November 2022. We were supposed to have it a couple weeks ago, but because of continuing effects of COVID, we felt like this type of event, we're really trying to build these bridges, isn't possible to do virtually, that you really need to be face-to-face. And we sold out last time 6 weeks in advance with 315 people. And so we really wanted to open it up to more people, and are hoping to have about 500 people there. So in planning this Colorado Food Summit 2.0, our goal is to bring together these diverse food system stakeholders in order to find opportunities to leverage food policy in support of a shared food vision for Colorado. And to say that part of what we're trying to do is to reflect on the fact that though I think the event was largely successful, we did receive some negative feedback that the planning committee was sort of the same old people who are usually on planning committees, and that and who was selected to be on the planning committee was not transparent enough. And so this time what we're doing is bringing together, we have one or more representatives from each of the local and statewide food policy councils, because we thought that was a transparent way that theoretically these local and regional food policy councils are representative of their regions, of the ag and food system in their region. It's not entirely true, but we thought they were sort of the best entity that could be representative or should be representative. We're also been working with an equity consultant who has been just fantastic. We actually had her come and speak as part of the Johns Hopkins. We did a regional food system training that I think Karen can speak to, but I think that would be available. I don't know if it was recorded, but anyway, she was just fantastic on that, and it's just been wonderful to work with. And so we were able to raise $100,000 from a foundation to just make sure that we did a better job in thinking about these issues around equity and making sure that they were embedded in all facets of this food summit. But because we had to postpone the summit, what the planning committee decided that they wanted to do was to actually hold these pre-summit regional convenings. And the website's not live yet, so this is a picture of what the website's going to look like, so the dates aren't real. But I think it's a really cool thing that we actually, this pivot we had to do because of COVID. This gives us an opportunity to try to lift regional voices and to really have some conversations first at the regional level, and then to decide what we're going to talk about at the state level based on what really emerges from these regional conversations and convenings. So I'm really excited about that. We've had one so far, and the other ones are all coming in the next month. They really start all popping in. So I think it's really going to be an exciting time. Last thing I just wanted to mention is that we've also been fortunate. I've been leading a grant for the past several years that's been funded by the Foundation for Food and Ag Research. And we've been able to add in this research and modeling component. So Denver, as I mentioned, is really interested in this Good Food Purchasing Program and the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council's meeting. But the challenge of having a mayoral appointed council is that it only includes people who live in the city and county of Denver, right? And so these other voices haven't necessarily been included at the table to think about some of the trade-offs that might exist from these different policies. And so through this funding in partnership with the city and county of Denver, we've actually been able to have this Good Food Purchasing Program coalition that's been meeting to bring together these broader set of voices to talk about the food policies. And it's actually meant that we've made some changes in how Denver's decided to make some changes in how they are adopting the Good Food Purchasing Program. And so I'm very, very proud of this effort and the work we've been able to do there. And through, I think, combining some of these research elements. So if you're interested in learning more about our project, we have a website here that talks about some of that modeling work we're doing. What we've done is to build an agent-based model, integrating a number of different types of modeling. So with that, this is the council's website if you want to see more about what the council's doing and check out some of those policy briefs.
Thank you, Karen and Becca, for that. Both of those presentations and perspectives, I think they offer a lot to learn and gain from. Just starting with a couple of questions that were in the chat. I think the first would be for Karen, just a question about, would you consider a state council to be a regional effort? And then Becca, you can think about this as, how do you involve state legislators with the summit?
We don't consider state councils to be regional. We have a different category for them, and mostly because they're targeting, they have a very specific target in terms of the policy work, and mostly it is targeting the state legislature and state policy. There are two differences in state councils that we try to tease out, and one is there are councils that are set up at a state level to be kind of an entity and council that's working on policy and moving it forward at their state legislature. We also noticed that there are a number of groups that are called conveners, and some of these overlap where they're supporting local councils and bringing them together and trying to really support their work, provide technical assistance. Those councils might come together through this convener to work on state policy, but oftentimes their role is more of a networker and a convener and providing technical assistance.
Thank you, Karen. And then the question about outreach for these summits of state legislators or other, policy makers, Becca.
Yeah, and Eric, if it's okay, I just want to say one other thing about Karen's question. One of the things that we have struggled with a little bit with the state council is that there are a lot of seats that are designated for certain representatives from different agencies and departments. And all of those individuals live in Denver, basically, right? Or somewhere really close by. And so what it ends up meaning is that the council is not very regionally representative. And so that's also something that I think makes a state council different than a regional council. It's something we've struggled with a lot in our state. So what we did last time, and we'll see what we're going to do this time, is we invited legislators to participate, but we didn't necessarily have them on panels unless there was a very specific issue they were dealing with. And we really very, very carefully curated each of the panels to try to provide what we thought were more balanced or sort of nuanced perspectives. And so part of my goal for that food summit, for example, was that everybody would leave thinking a little bit differently about some agri-food system issue. And we're actually trying really hard to track that. So we did a social network analysis so everyone who came, we had actually a 50% response rate did pre-post for those, to look not just at if people were talking to people in different sectors of the food system or in urban and rural environments than they maybe had previously, or if they, changed those types of relationships, but also something around values. And so now we're continuing to track that through the regional convenings and then also through the next summit to see these kinds of events take so much effort to put on and they're very expensive. And, is it worth it? Do we actually see that this is a way to move the needle, or are there better ways to do this? So anyway, they're invited, but they're not, we don't want this to be just sort of talking heads, if you know what I mean.
Right. And this would be a question for both of you, because I do think it's applicable, just talking about sort of the fluid and dynamic nature of councils or alliances or coalitions, and also the balance with, having a more formalized structure. And then within that, the importance of some type of backbone support.
You want me to go first? um, that's a lot packed into one question. So I'll start with kind of the fluidity of councils. And there's we've seen them change over time. They've gone from a grassroots coalition to a formalized nonprofit organization. Some of that change we see and shift in terms of organization type comes from their ability to get funding. So as a nonprofit organization, we see kind of a trend along with them being able to have a bigger budget, to be able to raise more money because they have some more structure. They're able to qualify for grants, where oftentimes as a food policy council, they may not be eligible. It has to be some sort of a fiscal sponsor or a nonprofit organization. But also recognizing that members come in and out, people change, their priorities change. They might accomplish one thing and then shift. The pandemic threw everyone into disarray in terms of how they had to pivot and change what they were doing. And that meant that some councils had to drop some projects that might have been longer term temporarily because they were forced into this position where they needed to address kind of emergency food needs. And so there was a lot of change. And the pandemic is kind of this very drastic shift in what they were doing, but oftentimes councils do ebb and flow in terms of the work that they do. We see many councils doing plans or assessments at some point in time to help to guide their work a little bit and give them a little bit more structure. But when you're talking about policy, some of it comes down to like, when is the opportunity for you to be able to act on that policy, and do you have the champions to do that? So they may get so far with an issue to where they realize that in terms of changing the policy that they want to, the time is not right. And so that has to be put aside. And so they shift to something else. So it's always great. You know, we advise that for councils, taking a moment every year, every other year to reflect on, do we need this working group? Are we making traction? Is it okay for us to shift our resources or to do something else that might be of interest to other members or bring new members on? Especially right now in terms of the conversations around race, equity, diversity, inclusion, a lot of councils are shifting their work because they're recognizing that they need to start embracing more diversity, kind of reckoning with what equity means for their council. And so that's changing their work somewhat. The relationship with government and whether they choose to be a formal council of government, whether they choose to have representatives from government on the council, whether they choose to be have no connection, no formal connection. Most councils have, there's like 2% that don't have any representation from government on their council. So the majority of them have some relationship, have a member that represents an agency that sits on their council. That more formalized aspect of whether they're created by legislation or they're an advisory committee of the government really kind of signifies the government's interest in food systems and the recognition that it has some value and they want to place some emphasis on it. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, because not often, but if the administration changes and they don't feel that the food systems is a priority for them, that council might not have the standing, the relationships, it just depends on the situation that they're in, to be as effective as they were before. So it's up to every council to kind of figure out what is that relationship with government. And it's always good to open those doors, have those conversations. They might not be at the table initially. They might not, you know, the mayor might not be on board initially, but there is often some other individual within some agency that has an interest and will be a part of the council. And so there's, you know, it could be a slow progression, but always having those relationships started at the beginning is a good place to begin. I'm done. Becca, do you have anything to add?
Well, that was a great answer. Something that the question made me think of is, you know, this question of representation and who can represent who. And it's an incredibly difficult question. And so, you know, I mean, with these formally appointed councils you know, they're setting out these seats. Anyway, it's a very difficult question. It's why we ended up having for the planning committee, right? The councils or coalitions, because it's hard to think about sort of who's left out, right? If you're trying to pick specific seats to make sure that the food system is well represented. And we've struggled with this topic a lot. And I think, I look at like the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council, and, there's inherently, because it's in Denver, and, the farmers that are represented are very small scale. And so then when there's interventions that are planned around, for example, municipal procurement, there's not really consideration of the fact that like it's hard for small producers to sell into schools, right? And there's like real barriers to that. And anyway, I think that there are benefits and challenges of having a formal and less formal structure. And, I think you just have to think about what makes sense for a particular place at a particular time.
Well, thank you again, Becca and Karen. And I think you'll be around for a little bit more if we have some questions, but I'd like to turn it over to Maureen. And thank you again for joining us on this learning exchange.
Yeah, thank you, Becca and Karen, so much. Really, really appreciate it. So before we head out, Katie has dropped a really quick survey in the chat. So if y'all don't mind, just kind of a pulse survey to get feedback on the learning exchanges as we do a few more of these. And we're going to be hosting these once a month for the next 3 months on the third Wednesday from 10 to 11. So we hope to see you all at future ones, and we'll be sure to send more information to follow. Oh, it looks like survey link is not working. Go ahead and save that, and we'll work out the efforts and then follow up with a survey after. So thank you, everybody. Really, really appreciate it. Yeah, Sam's working on the permissions. If you just keep the link, hopefully it'll work in just a minute.
And Maureen, I think we wanted to give people permission to leave if they had to, but I don't know if there's any additional questions, since we do have Karen and Becca on here still. Becca,
Yeah,
one question I had
go ahead,
was
Eric.
regarding the working groups and how that is, I think you had mentioned in response to COVID, and how they function and if they're funded as well.
They don't have any specific funding, but what ends up happening, because we left that like 25% FTE open, is that it does allow us to hire experts to come in and kind of move things along, which the way we have things structured now is so much better, I think, than having one person, because there's different tasks, right, that you need anyway. So it's worked out really well. And if you think about it, with all of the working groups, what you ended up having was sort of this director who was going and taking notes at a bazillion meetings and not able to do as much work. And now we have more of an admin assistant who can do that. So it's worked out really well. Some of the groups are moving faster than others. And we had the ag labor bill caused some major tension in the council. It really disrupted our council for a while. And I think people are still sort of recovering from that. And Eric, I say that because members self-select into these working groups because maybe they're passionate about a particular topic. So then maybe they put something out in a way that they see it. And then because they've had these discussions, when they bring it to the full council, if the rest of the council doesn't necessarily see it in the same way, the rest of the council hasn't necessarily been through that process that the working group's gone through in that same way. And that's been challenging.
If other people have questions, and Becca, sorry for this one. I was also curious about like the vetting process for the white papers, because I do think it's really important to get information and education out about policy, and how has the council worked through that.
Yeah, and actually that's what we're talking about right now. So that's why Blake was very smart at the beginning to create very clear policies and procedures about, like when is something considered adopted by the council. And so all of those are publicly available. All the council members see those when they're newly appointed. A challenge is that the council's appointed by the governor. and the governor has specific views. So the council isn't necessary, even though there are these seats that are dictated by the legislature, the council's not necessarily representative of the diversity of perspectives of the food system. Anyway, this is being recorded, so I'm saying, that there's some challenges in that. So now, and especially because the council's under CSU and we don't advocate for legislation, we're having these conversations about, we have these white papers, what is our role? Or how does the council actually go and make sure that these white papers get into the hands of people who are making decisions? So some of the working groups have done that independently, but we're talking right now about if we should have more of a sort of a session at the Capitol and what that should look like.
Well, thank you, Becca. I know some groups have, evaluating, what if action is taken and then what if action is not taken, what are the impacts and costs and benefits as well. But if there's other questions, and then there was a question about sharing your slides as a PDF, and okay. Other questions?
I have a quick question. Well, maybe not quick, but I just really appreciate it. Thank you both, Becca and Karen. Fantastic. And I think a lot of people in this group, this community, this larger regional conversation, which I know we're pulling people from different regions beyond Southwest Virginia, the Roanoke Valley, which is the whole point. We're trying to learn from each other. And I guess I have several questions, but the one I wanted to pose to both of you is regarding what feels like, if as asked, as people who have expertise in this work and clearly lots of experience, when things get hard, when, like Becca, your example is a perfect one. Like when things get, there's high tension, there's high, I'm thinking about representation, I'm thinking about ways in which people are trying to get through issues. And Karen, I'm thinking like all the different case studies that you presented. When push comes to shove, if you had to boil down one or two of the most significant characteristics that really kind of hold a council together for the right reasons, meaning you're there to make social change in the food system, what would you say? What would you suggest? What would you just put on the table? Say, these are the things I really think are the most valuable of all the things: structure, process, relationships, etc. We can probably put those in different categories, but I'm curious if you could pull out one or two ideas.
I think if people feel valued and that their time is valued and that they're there because people are listening to their perspective, I think we can keep people. We lost people because they didn't feel that that was the case with the ag labor bill discussion.
I would agree with that. I think there's a couple of other elements of people stepping in, not just with their own agenda, but with a perspective that they're there looking kind of more broadly. And it's not just the one item that they're trying to push that I think has more longevity than they coming in with the idea of what they want to change. And then there's elements of making sure that everyone understands how decisions are made, that everyone has an opportunity to voice their opinions. I mean, the hard part about this question is that those stories of like failure and not success are not necessarily widely shared. So, and that's what's so helpful to learn, like how do these dynamics and relationships work? And I think it's very telltale that councils spend so much time at the very beginning building relationships and trust so that they can work on harder issues down the line. But if you rush into the policy piece, you miss that relationship element, and those are crucial to the council continuing.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you can't make up trust.
And I think Becca and Karen, you could probably also, there's one thing feeling valued, feeling heard, listened to, but then dealing with the issue of compensation of time or travel. If if you're not being paid by the university or local government or another organization. That seems to be another real important aspect of being valued.
And I just also wanted to let folks know I removed Spotlight on everyone just because it's a more intimate group right now. And I know Maureen asked a question and just wanted to invite you, now that we've fixed the permissions, that people can unmute themselves. You're welcome to share more informally. And
yeah, Becca, I kind of posed that question. I think similar to what Eric was just saying, like it's really easy to say, well, this takes one person, and we all have different roles and responsibilities and skills, and we're trying to at least figure out, like, what is a network coordinator, facilitator, but then that person isn't doing all the things or being all the people. And so just trying to, whether it's through a network approach or even in a more formal kind of government system, like how do you, having more people at the table is good, and also it gets messy. So how do you really kind of think about that? Because when we've done it in this region before without any people who are paid to do it, it doesn't happen. And so having Maureen McGonigal really help facilitate it, makes it so that things happen. But then, how do we balance all the different needs, including a need for staffing with the collective?
Yeah, I mean, when I facilitated the council, which I did for a while before there was funding, and then I did it in this interim period where we had the first paid person left, I do the bare minimum to keep things going. I mean, that's why it's so much better to have somebody who's paid to do this. I mean, I don't mean to say I'm not paid because I have a job, right? But I have a full-time job beyond right this. So it's so great to have people who are actually meant to do it. Just as you all know, like trust building, you have to have strong communication to be successful. And if you don't have somebody who has time to put into doing that communication, like even in this interim period where I facilitated it, I had one-on-one calls with each of the people on the council, right, to really understand their perspective. Because as you know, when you have quarterly meetings, you try to get everybody to speak, but not everybody speaks. So you sort of hear more from some people and not others. And so understanding what the people who aren't as vocal are thinking is really important. If you want people to feel valued and participate. So having this staff person is just key. And, we're fortunate in Colorado in that we have an organization. It was previously called Live Well Colorado, now called Nourish Colorado, that they actually were the ones who went and they were able to fundraise to get to have their to basically get this bill passed. And it took us, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, I think. And then there were discussions because initially it was going to be the other years that the bill didn't pass. It was going to be, the position was going to be with the Colorado Department of Agriculture. And ultimately they decided to shift it to CSU. I like having it at CSU just because at least and I know different disciplines are different, but as an agricultural economist, we try to be sort of neutral, right? In the sense of like, we're not advocating for a certain position or another. And then I also think the Colorado Department of Agriculture, one of our challenges, like in lots of other places are dealing with this, like with all of these farm to school bills, for example, that keep passing, it tends to be the departments of education that have funds to pass out for that. They have no relationship generally with farmers. The departments of agriculture generally only have the relationships with farmers or maybe some input suppliers. And so I think the nice thing also about a university is that theoretically they're working across all of these different departments and agencies.
Is there any last questions before we officially close?
Becca, just about the funding itself, is that on like a 2-year basis, or does it require additional legislation, or?
It's unclear. So yes, and that was actually part of the challenge of why we lost our initial coordinator, because he thought it was sort of continuing. CSU's financial people said, oh, it's only for 2 years and then needs to get reapproved. But we continue to get it. And the organization that I said pushed the legislation, they've said it's continuing. Now, the problem is that the amount increased a little bit for a couple years, and now it's never going to increase unless there's additional legislation passed.
What's Lillian's role exactly?
Well, so we are in the process of forming a Food Systems Institute at CSU, and she's the program director of the Institute, is what we hired her for, with an idea that 25% of her time would be spent facilitating the council.
Gotcha. Oh, great pick. She's fantastic.
Oh, we are so lucky.
Yeah, she's great. I was really excited to see that. I didn't realize how that position was being tucked into the greater vision there. So that's interesting. Yeah.
And with Blake in that role of coordinator, he really wasn't leading the council to do that much in terms of the local food policy councils. And I think Lillian is shifting to think about how to do more with the local food policy councils, like with the food summit, that's part of it. But then also Nourish Colorado used to have funding for the local food policy councils to provide this umbrella. We had the Colorado Food Policy Network, and they haven't had funding for that in several years. So.
Thank you again, Karen and Becca, and probably be in touch because I'm sure we have more questions.
Thank you very much. And just so you know, Karen and I are in the process of trying to get some funding to do more support, have more support for regional councils. We've been doing this. We have a proposal into the USDA Ag Marketing Service with actually Jill Clark. I think Jill Clark will lead on the proposal. So hopefully that happens, and then we have more capacity to have these conversations.
Fantastic. That's cool.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.